Last class we were in chapter 10, but for the sake of trying to keep up with the remaining two classes we have this quarter, we're going to start in chapter 11 tonight. The main point at the second half of chapter 10, where we left off last time, is that Daniel, who has this vision in his very late 80s, maybe in his early 90s, it's the third year of King Cyrus's reign, and he's being shown a vision of an angelic messenger who is referring to himself and others as being a prince over kingdoms who's been at war with different kings or princes of the kingdoms of Persia. He talks about Michael, the prince of Daniel's people Israel, referring to angelic beings that were involved in some way with the will of God and the events going on in the human world, though it's hard to know exactly how these things operate based on what little is said at the end of chapter 10. But what he tells us is that he's come to tell Daniel a message about the events that are going to take place in the future regarding the people of Israel. And these events are going to be spoken about in chapters 11, and then at the end of chapter 12 is the end of this vision. And the amazing thing about chapter 11, aside from the fact that it is one of the most dense and complicated prophecies in the entirety of the Old Testament, chapter 12 beats it out only in that it is a little more complicated in how we would interpret it. But the reality is that when we look at chapter 11, what we find is these visions, in the vision of that Daniel's given, is a mention of the events that are going to happen, first with the Persian kings, then with the Greek kings, and this is leading up to the events that will take place when God brings an end to the indignation against sin, which if you remember from chapter 9, when Daniel prayed to God, he was praying with the focus being of what is God going to do regarding the city of Jerusalem, the temple, and his promises. And God answered him about the promise with the vision of the 70 weeks, which we talked about in our last class. And this is an expansion in some ways on more detail of the events that are going to take place in that interim period. The events that are covered in chapter 11 in the vision are all things that happen in what we call the intertestamental period. So this is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And when we look at human history, what we find is that the things that are spoken of to Daniel in this vision all came to pass. And so one of the reasons that I handed out the handout, I ran out of them, so if you don't have one, I apologize. Maybe someone near you has one, well, they'll let you look on it. It has a couple of maps that we can look at for some of the things we're going to talk about. There's a family tree for the two main kingdoms that we're going to be dealing with, the kingdom of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, who we'll talk about in a moment. And then there's some quotations from the book of 1 Maccabees. Of course, that being an apocryphal book, not one that is considered to be inspired. Even among the Jews, they don't consider it to be inspired. But it does work as a historical document to show us some of the things that Daniel is prophesying here as he records this vision that he has. So beginning in verse 1 of chapter 11, it says, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of the Greeks." So this is the man in linen that we just saw at the end of class last time, who had that divine appearance about him. And he is telling Daniel that from 3 years previous, he had been helping the Persian Empire. He had been helping them to be strong and protected. And now he is revealing what's going to happen in the future to the Persian Empire. And he says there's going to be 3 kings following the current one, which was Cyrus the Great. And then there would be a 4th king, and that 4th king would go to war with the Greeks. Well, when we look at human history, we see that the king after Cyrus the Great was a man named Cambyses, who ruled from 530 to 522 BC. He was killed, and then a man who is referred to in some texts as Smerdis, and other scholars have figured out that that guy was probably an imposter, so now they call him Pseudo-Smerdis. He only reigned for a few weeks at most as king before he was put to death by Darius the First. This is different from Darius the Mede. This is Darius Astyages, as he is also known. And he reigned over the empire from 522 to 486. So those are the three kings that come after Cyrus's time. And then the fourth king, well, the king who led the Persian Empire against the Greeks, we know very well from history because the Greeks wrote a lot about him, was a man named Xerxes. And Xerxes the First reigned from 486 to 465. He is most likely the same king over the Persian Empire that's mentioned in the book of Esther. He is known in that book as Ahasuerus, and he was possibly, the reason he has that party at the beginning of the book of Esther is because he was defeated by the Greeks at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. So when we look at the events of history, we see that Daniel is prophesying correctly about the things that will come to pass. And he says in verse 3, "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority, which he wielded for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides him." Well, when we remember the other visions that Daniel has had about the kingdoms that would come, we know that the Greeks were the kingdom that would follow the Persians, and they would have this great king. When we look at history, we know that first king over the Greek Empire was Alexander the Great. And after Alexander the Great's death, 4 of his generals divide up the Greek world. And so we see that in verse 4 of chapter 11 that the kingdom is broken up and parceled out into the 4 corners of the world as it's described. And he is followed by these 4 men. Scott.
I made a couple extra copies if there's anybody that wants.
Okay. So Scott has some extra copies. If you don't have one, you can raise your hand. So the first map on that page, the first page of the document shows you the way that the kingdoms were divided. You have Cassander, who took over the throne of Macedonia and reigned in Greece. And then Lysias Maccus was in control of Thrace to the north of there. Ptolemy Soter takes over Egypt and becomes the pharaoh there. And then Antigonus takes over the city of Babylon and rules over what was the eastern part of the empire. And then his son Seleucus I becomes the monarch after him, ruling over much of what was considered Asia in that time. So these kings that are now ruling, the greatest of these 4 kingdoms are the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Asia. And these kings are referred to going forward in the book of Daniel as the king of the south and the king of the north. The king of the south referring to the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the king of the north to the Seleucids in Babylon first and then later in Syria. And from the very beginning of those empires, Ptolemy the First and Seleucus both were able to establish their kingdom, and the one place that was stuck in between them is Israel, or what once was Israel, and then Syria. And so these 2 kingdoms would constantly fight over that particular part of land, as well as parts of what is today modern Turkey, as they battled for supremacy and trying to take each other over. So in verse 5, when it talks about the king of the south will grow strong alongside with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion, his dominion will be a great dominion indeed. That's most likely referring to those first 2 kings and how they established their control over things. Antigonus and Ptolemy were both traveling to Egypt, according to the Greek historians, before Antigonus decided, I'm going to stay in Babylon rather than go down to Egypt with you. So, everybody tracking, right? I love ancient history because I was a history major for one, but also just the thing that makes this so exciting to me is when we look at this, what this tells us is that God can predict the future. One of the reasons that some critical scholars will say the book of Daniel can't possibly have been written at the time that Daniel was alive in the 500s BC is because they look at these events and they are so perfectly accurate that they say, well, you couldn't have guessed at this. And I would agree, you're right, you can't guess at this and get it right that far in advance, hundreds of years. But if you're inspired by God and by His Holy Spirit, you are able to do that. You can predict these things because God authors the future and brings those things about, as the prophet Isaiah tells us. So what this can do for us is this can confirm for us, first of all, the power and authority of God, but it also shows the validity of the Word of God. When it agrees, when the events of history prove that it is what it is, that what it says does come to pass. So there are going to be a lot of names going forward, so that family tree, if you want, when you hear a name, if you find it on there, you'll kind of be able to see how time is progressing. Because these events are going to take place over a 200, 300 year period of time in human history, but it's going to be spoken of as always referring to the king of the south or the king of the north doing these things. Because if you remember, when Daniel talks about kings in these visions about human events, it's also in reference to kingdoms. So even though we can point to the individual rulers that did these things, it's the kingdoms, in a sense, that is in the view that Daniel is recording these things. So, going to verse 6. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will she remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. So one of the things that happens in the reign of Ptolemy II, Ptolemy II decides to make a peace treaty with Antiochus II Theos, and the way he does this is he's going to give his daughter Bernice to Antiochus so they can have a marriage alliance in that way. Well, for that to happen, Antiochus had to divorce his current wife, Laodice. And so when this happens, Laodice becomes so angry and jealous of this that she has a conspiracy put together and has Bernice put to death. And so then the alliance crumbles, and there is conflict again between the king of the south and the king of the north, and they go to war. So when it's talking about the woman there and how she will die, but one of those that is a descendant of her line will come to do battle, well, we know after Bernice's death that her brother, Ptolemy III, when he becomes king, waged a war to get revenge for his sister's murder, and once he has won the victory against his enemies, even has Laodice put to death in revenge for his sister's murder. When this happens, he also plunders the Syrians for the idols that they had in the past taken from Egypt. And so he returns these idols to the land of Egypt. Well, when we look at verse 8 of Daniel 11, it says, "Also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt, and he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years." Well, after that victory, Ptolemy III never goes to war again with the Seleucids and instead dies peacefully in the land of Egypt. But the sons of Seleucus II, they decide they're not going to put up with this slight against their family, and they're going to go to war with the Ptolemies. This is Seleucus III and Antiochus III, or the Great is the way he's usually referred to, Antiochus the Great. They go to war, but Antiochus' brother, Seleucus III, dies as they are going along to Egypt, and he continues on to attack the land of Egypt. Well, when we read in verse 10 of the chapter, it says, "His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hands of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail." Well, in that war that Antiochus the Great leads against the Ptolemies, Ptolemy IV has a fortress in the city of Raphia, and that is where they did battle. And in that battle, according to Greek historians, Antiochus lost nearly 10,000 infantrymen. And we see here that the prophet spoke of how he would cause tens of thousands to fall, and yet he would not prevail. Now, after this battle, Antiochus III goes back to his land, and he lives there for 14 years before gathering another army to go to war with Ptolemy V. And the reason he does this is Ptolemy V, when he becomes king, is only about 4 or 5 years old at the time of his father's death. So there was another man who was in charge of the army and leading it against Antiochus III when he goes to war with the king of the south. Now it talks about in verse 13, for the king of the north, verse 14. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will lift up themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. So as it's describing this period of violence, it mentions Daniel's people. He says, the violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up. Well, during the war that at this period under Antiochus the Great, when Ptolemy V was in command of the people of Egypt, the Jews at first side with the Ptolemies until they see the power of Antiochus's army. And so they decide, well, we're going to go to war on your side now. And when they do that, it's before there is a great victory by the Ptolemies where they defeat the Egyptian army. And following that victory, rather than Antiochus showing them gratitude, he instead goes down to the city of Jerusalem and to the land of Israel, and he stays there doing battle and conquering the land of Judea. And so this is how Syria and Judea become a part of the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus the Great. When we look at verse 16, it describes this by it saying, but he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. And according to Josephus, this is what actually did come to pass, that Antiochus did this to the people of Israel. So as these things are taking place, we see that when the people begin to take sides, and when I say the people, I mean the people of Judea. They're picking sides between the Egyptian army or between the Syrian army and trying to pick a team, as it were, that would be the most powerful, that could protect them and so that they could have peace. And they had been living under the authority of Egypt for a number of years up to this point before siding with the Seleucids. And from this point forward, the Seleucids have the dominant power over Judea. And when we read earlier in chapter 8 about the reign of the Greek Empire, in chapter 8 and verse 9, it describes how there would be a small horn which would grow exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. And this is a prophecy that's predicting a specific ruler who is soon to be introduced also in the 11th chapter, who is one of the sons of Antiochus the Great. But as the events of Antiochus's life come closer to their end, he tries to, through a marriage proposal to Ptolemy V, to marry one of his daughters, Cleopatra I, not the same Cleopatra from the time of Marcus and Julius Caesar. That's Cleopatra VIII, so you've got a few generations of Cleopatras to get through to get to there. But she is a young girl who he marries to this king, hoping that he can use her to bring down the Ptolemaic dynasty and so that he can take control of Egypt. According to the historians, this doesn't work. His daughter actually sides with the Ptolemies and takes great power in the court of Egypt. And this is what's described in verse 17 of chapter 11. He will set his face to come with great power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. Well, after his failed attempt to, through political maneuvering, take over Egypt, According to the histories of Antiochus the Great, he did go to the north and to Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and he attempted to invade the Greek islands. And it's the Romans who, at that time, were kind of the police force in Greece, because they had taken over much of the Greek mainland in that day, who put a stop to it. And when we read about what happens at the battles of Thermopylae and Mysia, the Roman consul, who has one of those really fun names when you're reading about the Romans, anytime they have multiple names, it means they were really important. So his name was Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiaticus, and he defeats the armies of Antiochus the Great, and they take Antiochus the Great's son, Antiochus the Fourth. Do you love how they keep using the same names? Because it's such fun. Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, and he is taken to Rome as a hostage to make Antiochus the Great, his father, stop causing trouble and conquering lands, because the closer he gets to Roman power, the more dangerous he will be to them. Now, after this, they also level a yearly tribute tax on the Seleucid kingdom of 1,000 talents a year. And if you remember from our sermon on Sunday, a talent was about 15 years' wages, so that's 15,000 years' wages of income he has to come up with every year to pay this bribe, as it were, so the Romans will not come and attack him. As he is doing this, he begins to plunder his own cities and fortresses, and according to the legend, he died in the city of Iliamus in the Babylonian province, trying to plunder a temple of the god Bel. And after this, his son, Seleucus IV, becomes the ruler, and his method of taking care of this yearly tribute was to raise taxes. And he puts a man named Heliodorus over the taxation of the people, and specifically tasked him to go to Jerusalem and to take things from the temple, take all the gold and silver that they had that he could take from the temple. So when we look back at chapter 11, there in verse 20, it says, "Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle." Now, the Heliodorus who was put in charge as the tax collector, according to Josephus, was part of a conspiracy that put Seleucus IV to death. And his son becomes the monarch then, after him. But then his brother, who's living in Rome at the time, he decides, well, I'm going to go be king because I have next claim of authority. So Antiochus IV travels to Syria, and he begins using his influence and money and power to take over the kingdom from his nephew, and eventually, it's believed, put his nephew to death. So he becomes the new king. Well, when we look at verse 21 of Daniel 11, "In his place a despicable person will arise on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time." So Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Epiphanes is a way of saying God manifest. Later in his life, he claims that he is the god Zeus incarnate. And so we have coins dating from his reign that show that he did take this title and this claim that he was Zeus himself. On the back of the coin, it's a picture of him as if he is Zeus sitting on a throne, and on the front of it is his face with the title God manifest over him. And if you look at your handout, you'll see some quotations on that second page from the book of 1 Maccabees. And I made that for you because I didn't figure most of you would be bringing a Septuagint to class with you tonight. But in verse 11, it talks about, in Maccabees 1, "In those days the lawless son went out of Israel, and they persuaded many, saying, 'We should go and make a treaty with the nations around us, because for that time we separated from them. Much evil has found us.' And the idea was attractive in their eyes, And some from the people were willing and went to the king, and they gave them authority to perform the duties of the nations. And they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the customs of the nations, and they made a foreskin for themselves and discarded the holy covenant and joined with the Gentiles and were sold to act wickedly. So this is describing what is predicted here by the vision, that in this time of peace, he would enter this part of the land where all the wealth was. And remember, that's referring to Jerusalem and to Judea. And he was going to win over people by giving them plunder and giving them positions of authority and giving them power. And we see that that's exactly what the author of 1 Maccabees and later Josephus report did happen, that some among the Jews who desired positions of authority and influence in these pagan governments went over to the pagan side, and they began to pretend they were pagan and act in a pagan manner. And this will later take place, lead into the conflict that is the result of later the Feast of Dedication that we read about in the New Testament, or today we know it as Hanukkah. But what leads up to that is that Antiochus determined he would go to war against his nephew, who was reigning there in Egypt, the king of the south. In verse 25 of Daniel 11, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for the schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Now we know that what happens when Antiochus invades, and that's what the bottom map was on that first page of the handout. He comes down and he is able to invade Egypt all the way to Alexandria, which was where the capital was, and he lays a siege there until his nephew is instructed by some of his advisors to make peace with his uncle. And so they sit down and they have this banquet, and they both are intending to find a way to get out of this and defeat the other one. And that's what we see described there in verse 27, that both kings have an evil intent in their heart, and they're speaking lies to each other at the table. But on his way back from this supposed victory and making a treaty with his nephew, in verse 28 it describes, then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. Well, we know that after that victory over his nephew, as he's returning, he plunders the city of Jerusalem. And in the book of 1 Maccabees, in verse 16 of the first chapter, it says, "And the kingdom was prepared for Antiochus, and he decided to exercise his rule over the land of Egypt, so that he might rule over the two kingdoms. He went into Egypt in fierce force with chariots and elephants and with cavalry and with great navy, and he prepared for war against Ptolemy, the king of Egypt. And Ptolemy was shamed from his face and fled, and many casualties fell. And they captured the fortified city in the land of Egypt and took the spoils of the land of Egypt. And Antiochus turned after striking Egypt in the 143rd year, and he went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a fierce army, and he entered the sanctuary in arrogance and took the gold altar and the lampstand for the light and all its accessories, and the table of presentation and the drink offering cups and the bowls and the golden censers and the veil and the crowns and the golden adornment applied to the face of the temple walls, and he peeled it all off. And he took the gold and the silver and the valuable accessories, and he took the hidden treasures that he found. And having taken everything, he departed to his land, and he made a massacre and spoke with great arrogance. And there was great mourning in Israel in all their places." So he completely wipes out all the gold that he can find, all the silver that he can find in the temple. He puts to death many of the people in Israel who were holding faithful to the law. And those who had sided with him already, they were already trying to force Hellenization, or to make the people begin to live in a pagan way at that time. And a year goes by, and he decides he's going to go back to Egypt to finally end his feud with his nephew and take over that land. In verse 29 of Daniel 11, it describes this. "At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsook the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. So he describes here what's going to happen when Antiochus goes to war again, and it's exactly what does come to pass. And this is one of the most famous incidents in Antiochus IV's life, that as he's going down towards the city of Alexandria to lay siege to it again, a Roman delegation comes. And this Roman delegation, according to the legend of the story, is led by a man named Popilius, and he is a Roman ambassador for the Roman Senate, and he has a cane with him, and he says he needs an answer he can take back to the people of Rome, to the Senate. And Antiochus tries to send him away so he can convene a council and make a plan of how he'll answer. And according to the story, Popilius takes his cane and he draws a circle around Antiochus IV, and he says that if he leaves the circle before giving him a reply that he can take back to the Roman Senate, it would mean war with the armies of Rome. And so Antiochus, because he's stuck there between a rock and a hard place, knowing he could not defeat the Roman Empire, he withdraws and does not continue his conflict, and then immediately goes to Jerusalem and sacks the city, puts many of the people of Israel to death, completely despoils the temple, and defiles it by supposedly building an altar to the god Zeus on the holy altar of God within the temple. According to some sources, he slaughtered a pig to Zeus or set up a statue to Zeus there as a way not only to worship Zeus, but in essence also worship him, as he claimed to be that deity. Now, the reason this matters is that Daniel had already been asking God, what are you going to do for my people? Are you going to keep those promises? Are you going to keep the temple and the city of Jerusalem? Are they holy to you still? For your name's sake, he prays for God to help the people and help the city and help the temple. And now he's being told in this next vision, the temple's going to be despoiled. The people are going to be put to death. There's going to be suffering for those that try to live faithfully according to the law. And some are going to turn and side with the pagans. And so you just imagine Daniel as he's hearing this and trying to take it all in and not really understanding everything. He wouldn't know about these events happening yet and how they would play out. But what he's hearing is terrible things. If you're a man who is concerned for God's people and his name and his worship and for his temple and his city, and what he's being told is that there will be a faithful remnant. That even among those who are there, in verse 33, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Here's the thing that when I was first studying the book of Daniel for myself and getting ready to teach it for an adult class, that really kind of makes you realize just how important this vision is and how important this book was for the people of Israel. How were they going to gain insight and have courage when they see these things happening and they see this pagan ruler coming in and doing these terrible things to God's temple? Well, part of the answer is they would have this book. And so those who have insight among the people and give understanding to others, what are they going to be able to do? Well, they're going to be able to sit down, and as they're reading this scroll of Daniel, or however they might have had it, and then they're looking around at the current events and then previous events in history and start realizing, wait a second, this is happening right now. And that would give them courage, for one thing, because it says that as the king is doing these things, in verse 34, now when they fall, they will be granted a little help. God was going to help the people, even in the midst of this suffering, even though many of them would be put to death in this persecution against them. But there would also be others, the end of verse 34, many will join with them in hypocrisy. But then in verse 35, some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them perfect until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So verse 35, for those people who are suffering and being put to death because they will not turn to worship the gods of the Seleucids, but rather want to worship the Lord and remain pure before him, when they're seeing these things happen and they see people being put to death, they're reminded then by Daniel's book that these people are purifying themselves. They're purifying themselves for the end time, for these latter days, and it says there, because it is still to come, that there's still things that God has promised that are going to come about for his people, even though it might have seemed in that day that everything was lost. And so when it talks about these things, in verse 36, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Now there are some who, when they read that, they think it is still about Antiochus IV, and that is certainly possible. He considered himself to be the God above all other gods. He spoke against the God of Israel. He prospers for a time. But the thing that makes me think it might not actually be about Antiochus is that it refers to the fact that he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Now, the indignation, remember, if we go back to chapter 9, in the vision of the 70 weeks, in verse 24 of chapter 9, and I promise we're winding down class tonight because we're going to do the rest of 11 and we'll do 12, Lord willing, next Wednesday night. It says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Well, in that vision that he was being told, this is the answer to your prayer, he's reminded there's this Messiah, this promised king who's going to come. And he would come after the city of Jerusalem was rebuilt and after this period of time goes by. Well, we know that the Messiah is Jesus. So when we're reading in verse 36 of chapter 11, and it's talking about the end of the indignation, which would refer to the indignation of sin, the indignation of God's anger against his people, that all of those things, well, they're going to be ended in the sacrifice of Christ. So most likely then, chapter 11 and verse 36 would not be referring to Antiochus, because he did not live to see the time of Christ, but rather to that fourth empire that was to come. Because we have to remember, when it refers to a king in these prophecies, it also can mean a kingdom. And it does not say who the king is there in verse 36. But if we look down a little further in the chapter to verse 40, it talks about this king going to war with two other kings. At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. So this is the king of the south and the king of the north doing battle with the king that's spoken about in verses 36 through 39. Well, we know who it is that defeats and ultimately ends both the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid dynasties and kingdoms. It's the Romans, and it happens around the 60s BC. So what we know then is that the Romans are the ones who put an end to these two kingdoms that have been warring and having control over the land of Israel and of the city of Jerusalem for this time. And then we see in verse 41, this king enters the beautiful land, or the land of Jerusalem, of Judea, of Israel. So what we find then is that more likely, more accurate to what we see in the New Testament as well, is that this king that we're going to look at next week in verses 36 through the end of chapter 11 is more likely referring to the Roman Empire and its kings than it is referring to the king Antiochus IV. Now, there are some who, they take another view. In fact, one commentary I was looking at had 9 different views for this final part of chapter 11, and most of them strain credulity for me. And some will look at this and they'll start talking about the Antichrist and things that are yet to come. And we'll talk about that next Wednesday night as we're dealing with the end of chapter 11 and looking at chapter 12. But the reality is that the Antichrist that a lot of biblical scholars and writers will talk about are not using that term correctly, for one. They're not using it in a biblical sense as the Apostle John uses it in his letter. John uses it to refer to anyone or anything that teaches that Jesus is not the Son of God and did not come in the flesh. And he says there are many antichrists that have entered the world in his letter. So we need to understand that Antichrist is not going to be this political figure on the earth as is popularly talked about in some theological circles. And I'm sure David will have lots of comments for that for next week because he has a lot of experience with dealing with that topic. So I look forward to his help, Lord willing, next Wednesday night. I appreciate everybody sticking with me. I hope it wasn't too much information all at once. But you do have it in the handouts for chapter 11 if you want to go back and look at those details for yourself at a later time.